Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tanya Van Biesen, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Viewers, all of you out there today, thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We are grateful for the opportunity to be able to come together to learn on this land today. Now, turning to the issues of the day, with housing prices continuing to soar, inflation at levels unseen in 20 years, the universal impacts of climate change, supply chain issues, and yet some strong employment numbers, trying to plot what is next for the Canadian economy could seem next to impossible. Now, luckily for us today, we have two sage Canadians to help us parse it out and think to the future. Mr. David Dodge is here with Kim Parlee to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities for the Canadian economy and on ideas on how we can strengthen for the future. Before we hear from our speakers, here's some quick information about how to participate today with us. The click here to switch stream button helps if you find that your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality should remain strong. Once you click the questions tab, you can enter your questions in the window and they will be sent to the moderator. And the request help button located at the bottom right corner of the page is for technical support. Now I'd like to introduce a great Canadian, Mr. David Dodge, currently a senior advisor at Bennett Jones LLP. He began his storied career in academics before moving on to public service, where he held numerous positions in a variety of ministries, including Deputy Minister of Finance. He's well known for being the Governor of the Bank of Canada from 2001 to 2008, and returned to the academic fold to serve as Chancellor of Queen's University from 2008 until 2014. He has served and continues to serve on a number of boards in a variety of sectors across this country. We're honored that he's joining us today from Ottawa to share his thoughts and ideas for Canada's economy. And today, Mr. Dodge will be joined in conversation by Kim Parlee, VP TD Wealth and host of Money Talk on BNN, Bloomberg, and CTV. And now, as part of our tradition, if you have a drink nearby, I'll ask you to join me in a toast to our country, to Canada.
Canada.
Now, Kim, I'd like to turn the podium over to you and thank you very much for moderating today's discussion.
Tanya, thank you so much. And it is a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. I've had a bit of a preview in terms of what we're going to be talking about. And I think it's incredibly material for the group of people who are joining today to understand some of the dynamics that are going to be taking place over the next few years. Before I go further, David, first, how are you?
Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have this conversation. And, you know, I've got a screen here. People will not be surprised with BNN blaring all sorts of red headlines with what was happening with the Bank of Canada this morning and Tiff Macklem. And you and I were chatting before this and saying basically Tiff Macklem gave his view up to about 2023. And today, the great part is you're going to take from 2023 onward to kind of set the table. So and this is a very long-winded question, and I promise from here on in I'll get a little shorter. But just before I start too, I'll remind everybody that you can send in your questions. Send them in while we're having the conversation. I'll be seeing them. I'm probably going to be holding a lot of them until the end of the conversation, just because I know that David has a really, I think, profound thesis to walk through in terms of what he's watching. So that's what we'll do on the question front. And then, David, I was thinking as well, the last time I actually talked to you on camera, I think was 10 to 15 years ago, and the world was an entirely different place. I mean, just it's black and white. But the interesting thing is, I think when I think about what you're going to talk about, we're talking about 10 to 15 years in the future. And what I got from you is the world will also be a profoundly different place in 10 to 15 years. So maybe you could just start, if you wouldn't mind, just outlining what you think is going to be important to watch over the next 5-10 years, and then we can dig into it with a little more detail.
Sure, Kim. Yeah, the world does keep changing. And so one always has to look forward. And what are the 3 or 4 big adjustments that we're going to see over the next decade or so? Well, the first, of course, we are going to have to get serious about adjusting to climate change. This is going to require major private investment. It's going to require major public investments, and it's going to require adaptation by workers in terms of skills and both skills and, of course, location. So that's one big thing that is staring us in the face. The second big thing that has been staring us in the face and becomes absolutely acute during the coming decade is the aging of society. When I say becomes acute during the coming decade, we've known this has been coming for years, absolutely. But becomes acute for 2 reasons. First, the baby boomers, who are at the moment still in the sort of 55 to 70 year group, they move out. And there's a major challenge as to replacing them because they're just big number of folks that were born during that period. But the leading edge, those folks that were born 46 to 51, for example, they begin to hit their mid 80s and their early 90s during this decade, which is the big high health expenditure year. And so we have to make that adjustment. And the third thing that we have to adjust to, or are adjusting to, is, let me call it, the digitalization of our economy. And that's a different sort of adjustment. It's one that actually one might hope will raise labor market productivity, labor force productivity, and hence tend to compensate for the fact that we have a declining share of our population actually engaged in the labor force. But initially, it requires big investment to change our work processes and our production processes to facilitate the use of these technologies, which, while they should increase productivity over time, also increase fragility of the system as well. So those are the big things that we're facing in this decade of the 20s to 2035. And it starts, of course, with an adjustment from the perturbation that took place from the winter of 2020 to roughly till the end of 22 or to the middle of 23 because of the pandemic. So, but it's these big long-term things that are important. And the one factor that underlies all of this is that as a society, we have to consecrate a much higher fraction of our national income to investment than we have been doing in basically since 2008, but a fortiori since 2015.
So if I say climate, aging, and digitization, that is where the world is going. That's a moving train. You see it moving. Then let's step back and say, is Canada, our Canadian companies, our governments, are we ready for it? What needs to be true for us to be to succeed in that kind of environment? And are you seeing that happening?
So I think the answer is in the back of our minds. We've sort of recognized that this is there, but now coming out of the pandemic, it becomes crunch time, because this is the period, let's say from 23 onwards, we're going to have to do what we didn't do in adjusting to these forces, because these forces are not entirely new since the pandemic. We didn't make the adjustments in the earlier period. Now we've got to move.
I want to dig in on that, because whenever economists and people, schooled talk about adjustments, it sounds gentle, and then the reality sometimes it may not be. So what do you mean by adjustments?
Well, let me first acknowledge one thing, and I think this is really important. I mean, we are uncertain about how some of this is going to unfold, and it's not just the uncertainty of getting out of the pandemic. It's the uncertainty of how the technologies are actually going to unfold over that period. So let's acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty. Some people call it radical uncertainty at this point, and not think that there are some cookie cutter answers to deal with it. So the first thing that I said, and the big thing, is that we have to be prepared to invest much more than we have been. And that means for firms, it means paying out less of earnings than has been paid out, either in the form of dividend or in the form of buybacks or whatever. It really does mean a much higher investment ratio than we have had. And for governments, what it means is, to the extent they have powers to borrow, they have to borrow for productive investment rather than for income distribution or income maintenance. And that is the thing that is very tough, I think, to accept. It's tough for all governments. I think it's particularly tough for the government here in Ottawa. And it's, I think, hard for Canadians to grasp how big an effort this is going to be. It's certainly possible. It's just that it's going to require a different mindset as we move forward. A fortiori for climate change, but for digitalization as well. And then, of course, for healthcare, we've ignored for a long time the necessity to make investments in the healthcare system, to convert our non-system into a system that allows us to deliver healthcare and care services appropriately.
So, and tell me if I'm hearing this accurately, David. So I'm hearing the nature of investment, the nature of what governments and companies, choose to put money out on needs to change. Again, more into reinvestment, less into returning capital or whomever, to shareholders, those types of things too. That in your opinion priced in terms of what is going to be unfolding in the next little while? Because when I hear that, and correct me if I'm wrong, more investment eventually leads to greater income, leads to greater prosperity. In the shorter term, it's just dislocation. Maybe there's less money coming to people. Maybe there's less stimulus in the short term to kind of keep just the day-to-day moving. Is that an accurate assessment or not?
That is accurate. That is absolutely accurate. I hate the old hackneyed phrase. There's some short-term pain for long-term gain. Pain in terms of current levels of consumption, not necessarily pain that the world is going to be a bad place. Maybe it will be. That's the normal uncertainty. But yes, we're just going to have to devote more effort to it, and you can see this. There are a couple of key statistics that one should have in the back of your mind in terms of the magnitude of effort. Two things. First of all, our labor productivity relative to the OECD and a fortiori relative to the US, which has not actually done all that well in the last decade either, has fallen quite dramatically. So that there is no way, with a shrinking share of our population in the labor force, with minimal productivity gains, right, that we're going to be able to support the level of incomes that we have got used to, at least in the short run. If we make the investments, do the right thing, then we will raise the productivity of the labor force on the one hand, and we will have put in place some of the social and economic infrastructure that allows us to build on that in the future. So that's one side. But the other side, which is absolutely key, is that we require more energy per unit of GDP in this country than any other country in the world. Oh, one exception, Iceland. Than any other country in the world. We are just enormously, we consume enormous amounts of energy for a given unit of output. And that really has to come down, and has to come down markedly, just as we have to increase the labor productivity in order to have in 2035 the sorts of real standard of living gains that we might expect, given the structure of our population. And so investment becomes the key thing, much as was true. I guess none of us can remember precisely, but basically that was what the focus of Canadian policy was from basically 1946, or at least from 1949 through until the Pearson government. That was the focus, and growth was the key focus, and we did incredibly well over that period. And we've been doing less well and less well and less well since then.
How is Canada set up for this right now? I think that's the one, because I hear everything you're saying, and I feel like, excuse me, there's a lot of things to manage right now. If you think about all the challenges we have, there's each one of those is massive. And I just think, coming out of COVID, like, are we set up? Like, are you optimistic? I guess I'll say.
Well, yeah. Do we have a national strategy? No. Do most firms have a strategy? Maybe. And that varies clearly across firms. Maybe. But until we can bring together, because most of this investment is private sector investment that's going to have to take place. But that can only come in the context of a national strategy to allow the most effective use of our resources over that period. And that really does require the public and private sectors to work together as a team, maybe with some direction, maybe not exactly having another C.D. Howe in charge of things, but nevertheless, somehow it's got to pull together. And we are not terribly well set up to do that. And I just hope that as we move forward now, that with hopefully the pandemic more or less behind us, that we will focus on that going forward rather than on distribution issues, which has been our focus for the last little while. Not necessarily inappropriately, but
yeah,
I just would make that observation.
When you look ahead, then in terms of, and I want to dig into each one, and I'll remind people I am getting your questions. We will come to them, I promise, shortly. But if from an inflationary or deflationary environment, again, for people who are thinking with this, we are in a period right now of transitory inflation. Transitory is in the eye of the beholder, I think, in terms of how long that lasts. But as you move out, the things you're saying, I'm thinking, okay, there's things going in place that sounds like you're going to stimulate less demand, which I think is inflationary. You can correct me, and I know you will. There's demographics, aging, which I think is maybe deflationary. I hear all these things. Are we going to go back into a deflationary world, or do you see us moving back into an inflationary world once things settle?
So, Kim, that is the great debate among economists at the moment. So we have had a period since, let's say, since the great financial crisis, when, generally speaking, in the world, and it's been true in Canada as well, we've been in a world that tends to have excess supply. That means it's tended to put downward pressure on prices. That means that the underlying neutral rate of interest has actually been falling. In economist jargon, R-star has been falling over that period. And so the question then, looking at 2023 and 24 and onwards, is that going to be the world we're in? And maybe it is. I said at the start, I think we're living in a world of radical uncertainty. But what I think is really underappreciated is that there is going to be a major necessity for investment over that period. Maybe some of it forced by government policy in the climate change area, but it will show up. It will show up in market rates as we go through this period. So that there is going to be this new intense, let me call it intense, source of aggregate demand. Secondly, it looks as if governments around the world are at the moment willing to continue to provide ongoing demand for distribution reasons, largely ongoing demand, and so that will create more demand. So as I look out, if you think of the past decade before COVID, was a decade when year after year, the basic trend was for demand to fall short of supply capabilities and us to have excess supply in the world. That was true in Canada, and as a 40 already been true since 2015. But going forward, it's not a question of investing in new oil sands projects. It's going to be a question of investing to make the production of oil and gas more GHG efficient, right? That requires big investment. And that's where the retained earnings are going to have to go. Our electrical systems, exactly the same issue, not that we've not done badly. We actually have low GHG for our Canadian electrical systems compared to the rest of the world. But we're going to use a lot more electricity, and it means that all of the additional is going to require huge investment. And the question is, are we going to produce any of that stuff? Are we going to produce wind turbines? Are we going to produce panels? Are we going to produce smart grid equipment? That's a very interesting issue. And if we don't actually produce some of that stuff, we will end importing it. And of course, that then, and as we reduce our exports of oil and gas, we're going to have downward pressure on the Canadian dollar and hence upward pressure on prices that Canadian consumers face. And so that is a real challenge unless we make the investment that enables us either to produce some of that green energy at home, if you will, or enable us to produce our oil and gas more greenhouse gas efficiently so that we can continue to export it. So we've got that challenge. We've got the challenge of converting our internal combustion engine economy to electrical economy. And we don't happen to produce any of that stuff in this country. And we don't have the ecosystems that allow us to do it. That doesn't mean we can't get there, but we have to invest, and that's going to require a huge amount of private investment, but it's going to require that government stand there side by side with the investors to take some of the risks of making those changes to build that ecosystem. And I hope we can do it without a lot of trade restrictions, which I think is a big worry for all of us, that in order to force the building of domestic ecosystems, that we will break down the international trade system.
Can you elaborate a bit on that? Just in terms of what specifically for Canada, what trade restrictions will mean for us in terms of building up that infrastructure? What are you most concerned about?
Well, I mean, just look at it. Take something simple that everybody in Toronto is well familiar with, and that's the conversion of our automobile parts and assembly industry from basically an ICE-based industry to an electricity-based industry. And that's a big challenge, right? And it's a big challenge that's going on at the same time as it's happening elsewhere. So the easy thing to meet the government's GHG targets is to import the electric vehicles, import the batteries, import the electric motors, import the electronics that goes into it. Well, that's all very nice to say. That's easy to do, but you got to pay for those imports somehow. And so in the end, then we would continue to have an ever greater current account problem going forward. So in the short run, governments are going to have to stand by, stand with, or whatever the right expression is, firms in supporting the building of a transportation equipment ecosystem that enables us to fill in Canada some of this demand going forward. And that's why I say it's major investment. It's not that it's impossible to do. It's going to require, I think, some government subsidy, which I think is probably better than tariffs for protection. It's going to require us working with the Americans, which is going to be very tough as we build these systems. Somewhere in North America, we're going to have some silicon chip plants. We can't just rely on it all coming across the Pacific. So this is the big challenge going forward, and that is just the climate change aspect, right?
Yeah, and I was going to, sorry to interrupt, but we're getting lots of questions in, David, and I think the one thing I'm kind of getting a theme in some of these questions, and I will come to some very specific ones in a moment, but you know, I think the concern I think some people have is, you know, we talk about clean energy and I mean moving towards the ESG world, and I know critics will sometimes say, well, you've decarbonized supply, but you've not decarbonized demand. So people still getting to fly across the country. It's a big place. How do we put things in place to manage that?
On the supply side, well, that's what I'm worried about, is the supply side. We know how to do the demand side. All we got to do is tax carbon, right? We can manage the demand side. People may not like it, but we can manage. We know how to manage the demand side of it. What we don't know, we don't have a strategy for, is how we manage the supply side. And as I said, I think my view of the world going forward is that we really have to focus. We in Canada, but this is true elsewhere as well, we really have to focus on the supply side rather than just the demand side. Now, there are some demand issues, right, that we need to deal with, and those are tough. Those are income distribution issues, and those are the aging issues which you mentioned earlier. But our big problem is supply. It's not demand. We know how to manage demand. We may not like it, but we know how to do it.
Yeah,
right?
I was going to say, I don't think people like it. I think that's no, you're absolutely right. I want to make sure we touch all the three buckets before we get to questions. And what about the digitization piece? Because, you know, I'm just going to say, you know, you say digitization. I think a lot of people hear crypto, we hear Bitcoin, we hear Ethereum, you know, so, but I think when you're talking digitization, you're talking about all the things that make those currencies, you know, run the way they do.
Well, and it's not just currencies.
Right.
No, I mean,
it's everything else.
It's the whole production system. So on the financial side, I mean, we did a report we put out last week, looking at some of these issues. You know, we're now going to have to adjust very quickly on that side, and security is an enormous issue that sits there in the middle. Making those adjustments. But I think we kind of know what has to be done, basically to bring down transactions costs domestically, but really importantly, internationally, bring down transactions costs. And digitization absolutely is essential to do that. Exactly how we go at it, but there's, you know, there's great value in a public currency. Bank of Canada notes or coins or digital coins, right? And that's true everywhere. And so we absolutely are going to have to look at that. And that means adjustment, and perhaps quite big adjustment in the financial system. But that one we're going to struggle in government to put the framework in place that maximizes the value of that. But we've got lots of innovation going on and effort out there in the world. But as we move to digitalization of production of goods, we are replacing one type of labor with other types of labor. We'll be able to make use of AI in a way that makes our use of people much more efficient than it currently is. So I think on the digitalization side, while we have to make some big investments to start, including in the financial system, but in lots of other ways, and very importantly in our healthcare system, we have to make some big investments to start. But there are, let me say, rather quicker payoffs of that than we might see on the climate side, where it's going to be much more of a struggle than the techno-optimists would like us to believe.
It's funny you should mention digitization of health. I mean, I remember many years ago, decades ago, when I first started talking in a different life about digitization of health records, for example. That was 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's amazing to me that still, it's still something that's just taking place. And again, what's going to be the impetus to really move things forward in a meaningful way from your perspective?
Well, when I was Deputy Minister of Health, we started the federal program for that. And, it sort of puttered along. But in the end, you're going to have to use real muscle. And that real muscle is going to be for the federal government that we are not going to provide one more nickel, not one more nickel for healthcare until we have the digital records adopted, a universal digital record system. Pick one, right? Pick one. It's not that the technology is not out there, but adopt it so that, and that's number one. Number two, as critical to all of this, and it's true for the financial system, is that we have to have digital ID, secure digital ID system. And that's going to require people accepting that there is an entity, call it the Canadian Digital ID Manager Institute or whatever, a manager that has access to all of the stuff, right? That provides, if you will, the third key to make it clear that I am me when I'm using my iPhone or whatever device, and that you are you when you're doing it, and that the data in my record I can actually control, right? That you have to have my assent to use it. And those systems are there. Technologically, we can get there, and can get there in a way that we couldn't in 1990 when I was working on this. It's hard to think that's 30 years ago now. So technology is on our side now on that, but you really do need a couple of these key components. And so far, as citizens, we really are suspicious of that digital ID agency, let me call it, being the big brother that will know everything. But that's where, in a sense, where you have to get to. and be able to turn control back to the individual. That's exactly what is going on in the financial system. To be able to move my records at the Royal Bank to flashy fintech X that's going to do things differently than the Royal Bank does. And, it's a very cumbersome system because we haven't developed, not that we can't develop, but we haven't developed a way to do that securely.
I want, and I said, Dave, we've got some excellent questions coming in, but before I get to them, last question for you. We've talked climate, and I know we're just scratching the surface in all of these, but I value the frank discussion, what you're watching and what you think is important. Aging, we haven't really mentioned, you talked a bit about the importance of, healthcare, which obviously relates to aging, but what do you see as the important discussion we should be having here in Canada around aging?
Well, there's two issues here. One that we talk about but do very little about, and that is technical skills and reskilling. That requires big effort, not little bit here, a little bit there. It requires big effort by employers. It requires big effort by individual workers investing in themselves, and it requires big effort by governments. So that issue's been there for a long time. We've known it's been there, and we've never done it very well. We have guilds that make it very difficult to manage some of this. So that's that side. But the other side is, with new technology, people can work and have their health and are able to work quite well. Let's say till age 75, as a normal age where you would more or less completely remove yourself from the labor force or largely remove yourself. So you'd largely be in that. But we don't think very hard about how best to use older folks. As employers, we don't think as hard about that as we should. And certainly, as governments, we have set up a old age security system, which basically tells people to get out of the labor force rather than to stay in, because the effective marginal rate of taxation on earnings for people up in sort of lower middle income range up there turns out to be higher than it is for high income people. It's really not a very effective system. And we were going to move to age 67 for a lot of this, and the government canned that when Liberal government canned it when they first came. An enormous mistake. And we have to continue to move in the direction of using the skills of these folks going forward, rather than putting them on the slag heap, so to speak.
Agreed. Well, we've all learned how to reskill because we're all doing this from home. So there's a little quick example of all the skilling we've learned about to be our own tech support on this front. So I do want to get to some questions, David. I'm going to attempt a rapid fire here because there's a lot of good ones that are coming in. And these are good ones. Here's the first question. I'm going to ask you bluntly, verbatim what's here. Will Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency replace the US dollar as the new reserve currency?
I don't think so. No.
Why not?
Because the Americans are going to adjust. It's for the United States, having New York the center of the global world is just so critical that they will adjust to make sure. And so we see it. We see it with Facebook or DM, right? They moved from something that was going to be a coin free of a national currency to one that is the US dollar. And so that is going to happen. And so we're probably going to end with two global systems, if you will. There'll be one based in China, one based here in North America. But but that's where in the end we will be. For accounting purposes, for transactions purposes, that doesn't mean that for asset holding purposes that alternative digital coins, let me call that digital assets, are going to be there. So I think you have to distinguish between the three functions of money. Two of them, I think, absolutely will end with an improvement of our current system. On assets, there will be another set of assets, these digital assets.
Got it. Good question. Thank you for sending that question in. Next question. I'm 100% supportive of the need for a comprehensive aging strategy for Canada that includes healthcare and efficient and effective retirement income programs, including things like workplace plans. Given the long maturity curves of these programs, who is in the best position to lead, participate in developing this strategy? That's good. Who holds the pen on figuring out what the right answer is for a comprehensive aging strategy?
I don't have a good answer to that. In fact, because we have 13 governments that have an important role to play. We have thousands of employers who have an important role to play, and we have millions of citizens that have an important role to play. But there has to be a degree of coming together. I talked about it on investment side between business and governments, but here it's basically a three-way coming together as to how we are going to deal with it, and it absolutely means that there's going to be a higher fraction of our labor force in the care industry, whether it's health or not, but in the care industry going forward than we've had in the past. And we have to think about how we can improve the effectiveness and efficiency of those caregivers as well. That is an area of investment, but it's a little different than the others.
Yep. Okay. These are big problems. Another one, electricity is classed as a green energy, but coal-fired power plants currently fuel 37% of global electricity, and figures from the IEA show that coal is going to generate another 22% of world's electricity in 2040. For those who are paying attention, of course, coal prices are through the roof right now too. It is now, it's the single largest source of electricity worldwide. How does this equate to a reduction in our carbon footprint? And again, just the disconnection between people see electric as green, but they don't look to where the source of the electricity comes from, I guess.
Yeah. So this is what's going to be wrestled with in Glasgow. I mean, we are a long way there, right? We are probably the most green electricity, one of the greenest electricity producing countries in the world. So it's not an issue of greening what we currently produce. Our problem is, looking forward, how do we produce the new volumes of electricity that we're going to need to facilitate green consumption, right? Yeah. So we have some advantages. We still have some exploited water power, but we know that is big investment up front. And as we can see from Muscat Falls and Site C, there are risks, and these are expensive. There's nuclear, where we have some comparative advantage, and maybe we'll quickly the SMR side of things, and that would be an exportable product for us to green the system. But we also have to deal with the grid, because the grid, the so-called smart grid, to be able to handle fluctuating energy production sources is much more difficult and requires a lot more input than our current grid system. I think we in Canada, I think this is, I point to our electricity sector, both public and private, as being kind of a star, and where one can be much more optimistic than one can be about in India or in Indonesia or whatever. So how they are going to do it, that's another issue, and I can't answer that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's part of the reason I think we're seeing, you know, I mentioned the coal prices surging to exactly to what you're talking about right now in those countries. Next question, this is a good one. What do you think about the digitization in the context of AI automated decision-making by governments? The federal government has issued a directive on transparency AI used for decision-making to ensure procedural fairness. Should this be a priority? So again, I'm going to put this in my own words. You know, when we give over the authority to decisions being to an AI system, which may have its inherited prejudices, you know, inside of it. What are your thoughts on that as we move towards more digitization?
Yeah, so I mean that goes along with the digital ID issue that I was talking about earlier, which, quite frankly, I think is one that the digital ID one is doable. We just have to muster the will to get there. The bias in AI, if you will, is a trickier issue, and what it really comes down to is that there has to be transparency in the algorithms that are used. Some of that, I think, is quite doable. So, you know, at the simplest level, vaccines, right? You can be pretty transparent about the algorithm that you use to get a check mark, right? But that's simple, right? When you get something that's more complex that you're going to try to manage, then that's more difficult. I would make the final point. I would make the final point, though, that our big challenge is that our data bases here are fragmented. And the power of AI comes from having the broadest database to allow learning, right? And we in Canada, and indeed in North America, that is our challenge. We have the bright people, the creative people on AI compared to the Chinese, but the Chinese have this enormous database that can be accessed in a way that is not true here. So that is a problem, how we move forward on that. And that even if you just keep it in the health system, right? Just keep it in the health system. I mean, it's fragmented. Our databases are fragmented. And we ought to be able to do about the best in the world, given the heterogeneity of the Canadian population. But it's all in separate databases. So we can't apply AI in a way that we know could make us absolutely leaders in some of the health areas if we could actually get at all those data.
I'm hearing the frustration of your previous portfolio trying to deal with this stuff as you're thinking this through, but you know, it's true. I have two last questions for you. I'm going to give you a blunt one about green energy and energy consumption. Then I want to get your final thoughts before I turn things over back to Tanya. But here's the question. And again, I'm not editing here. I'm just going to tell you as it's written. So it's you say cutting back markedly in energy. How really is this country going to do that? Stop flying, stop driving. You know, what are some things we can do today? You know, the idea is that everyone else has to change, but not me. So just, you know, and I know you said taxing demand, we may not like it, but any thoughts on that? Because, you know, this is hard, right? Like this transition is going to be hard.
It's hard and it's in a number of areas, right? It's in a number of areas. basically going electric. Let me simplify one. That's one aspect, going electric. The second, of course, is that we use a lot of, we require a lot for heating and cooling. And that takes time, but we can build buildings that are much more efficient. We can, over time, replace furnaces, gas furnaces with heat pumps in some instances, but this takes time because there's a huge amount of built infrastructure, right? And you don't throw that all out. You do have to retrofit. In transport will probably be the easiest one, easiest in the sense of technically easiest. We move to electric light vehicles, and we move to, well, we'll see, hydrogen heavy vehicles for transport, and we'll see what we do for aviation. But once again, that's the problem we have. We build turbines, and Pratt & Whitney builds turbines, current turbines. Are they going to be able to build something for non-jet fuel propulsion, right? So this is why I keep coming back to the fact our problem is supply problem. How we are going to do this. And our governments can put up fancy targets all over the place. They can promise the world, but those promises are meaningless unless you can actually supply the alternative energy and supply the means to use the alternative energy. And that's our problem. Yes, we could import it, but well, how are we going to pay for those imports, right? So in the end, we have a big supply issue. And that's why I put the emphasis that we have to have major investment. The peak investment as a share of GDP in this country was in 1981, and it was 25.3%. May have the decimal wrong, but that's roughly what it is. We have been running at about 18, so that's a big gap. And I don't quite know how the IMF did their estimate, but their estimate is that we need to get to 26 in this country, which, as I said, is higher than we have achieved in any year since 1981. And I think 81 was actually the post-war high as well. So this is a big change. It's a big change. It's doable. It is doable. We have to think about it. And we need that strategy that pulls together businesses who will be the major investors here. They will have to make the major, not financial investments. They're the ones that have to make the major physical investments to actually do what we need to do. And then governments have to provide the infrastructure to facilitate that. And our financial system has to be geared up to deal with that. And then that's a lot of what Mark and the folks over in Glasgow are going to be talking about.
I think that is the perfect way to end this off, because I was going to ask you what needs to be in place, and you just David, such a pleasure. That was a far-reaching conversation, but so great just to get your wisdom on all the different parts that need to be working in place. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And Tanya, I'll turn things back over to you.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you to everyone actually who spent your lunch hour with us today. Thank you, David, for joining us today. We are very lucky to have heard from you about the shorter and long-term predictions for Canada. I think if I heard some very clear themes from you, they are investment, investment, investment. You also talked about the importance of having a national strategy. I suppose it's that part that worries me the most, because we're having trouble getting along at the moment, and maybe we don't so much need to get along, but we at least need to be talking to each other to develop a national strategy on all of these issues. And then finally, I am going to work very hard to work R star into a sentence going forward. So that's my challenge for the next week. Kim, thank you for your terrific guidance of our conversation today, for taking those questions and for guiding us through some of these complexities. We are really thankful to have you here on the podium. I'd like to thank our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and LiveMeeting.ca for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. And then guests, I just want to extend to you some of our upcoming events. On Tuesday, November 2nd, we will meet in person to host Éric Martel, who is President and CEO of Bombardier, to hear his vision and mission for the future of the company, and actually the key role that Ontario will play in that future. Wednesday, November 3rd, we host a cryptocurrency panel, very topical given today's discussion. And on Thursday, November 4th, we turn to financial literacy. So please plan all of your lunches with us that week. To learn more about our upcoming events, explore our newly designed website at canadianclub.org. Please browse our rich archives of past events and check out our new membership categories with enhanced benefits at a whole variety of levels. Please do consider becoming a member of our club to support the club's work and to support this ongoing podium of important discussions. Guests, thank you for joining us. To everyone, please stay healthy and please stay safe.